Today's daf is daf tes, and we started daf tes yesterday. We'll just summarize the last point that we discussed yesterday so that we can start with Itmar, which if you count down from the top of the Amud on daf tes is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down from the top. And the last discussion that we had on the top of daf tes was that there seems to be a logic in Rabbi Yochanan that if the Torah allows for the carbon to be brought in the Azara, then how much more so it could be brought in the Heichal, because the Heichal is more intense. It has a greater level of Kedusha. And therefore, we have a principle of Shelo Yehei Tofel Chomer Min Ha'ikar. And then the Gemara goes on to differentiate between Achila and Hakrova, because in the case of Achila, it's not appropriate to eat in front of Hashem in the Heichal. And therefore, we're not going to apply the principle of Lo Yehei Tafel Chomer Min Ha'ikar. So that's what we discussed yesterday, and today we begin with Itmar. And now we're discussing the Belila. Belila in a mincha means when they take the shemen and they add it to the flour and they mix it together. Balala chutz lechomas hazara, so that even though the mincha itself and the kmitza of the mincha, which is the main avodah mincha, has to be done within the Azara, but nevertheless the Belila is going to be a subject of controversy as to whether or not the Azara, which is surrounded by walls, is absolutely critical for the Belila. Rabbi Yochanan or Psula. Rabbi Yochanan says that you must do the mixing in the Azara, meaning that Rabbi Yochanan is going to upgrade the action of Belila from that of a hechsher, just a technical preparation, to part of the avodah itself. And just like the avodah of the mincha has to be done in the Azara, so too the Belila has to be done in the Azara. But Reish Lakish Amar Kshera, the Gemara analyzes. Reish Lakish Amar Kshera Dirsiv V'yatzak oleha shemen v'nasan oleha levona. Let's look at the sequence of the psukim. First, the Torah, in the beginning of Vayikra, in Perek Beis, it says Yitzika and Levona. So this is the mixing. And then Vahadar, in the very next pasuk, it says Vehivia el bnei Aaron hakohanim v'kamatz. And then the kmitza is brought and implemented later on. So the sequence is clearly such that mikmitza v'elech mitzvahs kahuna. When it says ve'via el bnei Aaron hakohanim, and the requirement is here is that of kohanim, that's only from the point of kmitza and on. But anything that came before kmitza in the pasuk does not require kahuna. Now, if that be the case, then certainly Belila does not require a Kohen. Limed al Yitzika u Belila, because Yitzika and Belila, as we said, is in the previous pasuk, Sheksherim Bizar. Now, if a non-Kohen is acceptable for Belila, then for sure it doesn't require an Azara, because it's not an Avodah. So that's Reish Lakish, mida kahuna lo boy. If you don't require a kahuna, and the Belila could be done by a zar, then we should therefore derive the conclusion that pnim, meaning to require that you bring the flour and the oil and the levona inside the azara in order to set up the Belila lo boy. So therefore, it comes out that according to Reish Lakish, we have an analogy between the requirements of who has to do the blila and the place where the blila has to take place. If there's a requirement of kahuna, then the place will have to be inside the azara, within the chomas azara. But if, on the other hand, the zar is fine for blila, then the makom could be outside the azara. So now the Gemara turns the ping pong ball into the court of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Psula. Well, that's not so simple, because we just came to the conclusion that the kmitz of the elech mitzvahs kahuna. That means the yitzika and the belila that came before the kmitza does not require kahuna. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan has a logic that compels him to conclude that although you don't require kahuna for the belila, but nevertheless you do require the azara. And what's the logic that compels Rabbi Yochanan to that conclusion? And that's kevan dasiyasa b'kli. In order to prepare the mincha, the flour and the oil and the levon has to be put inside a kli sharis. Now, the kli sharis is going to sanctify the ingredients of the mincha. Now, if you are sanctifying, then that's something you have to do in the azara. So nehi de kahuna lo boy, but pnim niha boy. So that even though, as far as the individual who is implementing the act of belila, we don't require kahuna, which would seem to lead us to Reish Lakish's conclusion. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan says, but you require a kli sharis. And if you require a kli sharis, that means that it's part of the avoda. It's not just, mixing two ingredients or three ingredients together. So again, if it's an avoda with regard to the requirement of kli sharis, then it becomes an avoda with requirement of the azara. And Reish Lakish is of the opinion that unless it's an avoda requiring kahuna, it doesn't require azara. Tanya Kavosid Rabbi Yochanan, we have a brisa that's pretty outspoken about this machlokas and takes the side of Rabbi Yochanan, Belola Zark Shera, although Belila is before Kmitza, and therefore it's me Kmitza V'elech Boi Kahuna, so therefore we don't mind if a Zar will do the Belila. However, Chutz Lechomas Hazar Psula, it's about as it's outspoken as you can get. And therefore, we come to the conclusion that the Gemara has absolutely proven and established that Rabbi Yochanan is correct. Itmar. Now we have a second machlokas recorded between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish regarding the mincha. Mincha shechasra kodem kmitza. Now, what we're saying here is that the Torah requires that the mincha be shlema, malea, meaning complete. If part of the mincha is lost, then the mincha is psula. In fact, yesterday we discussed the case of the lechem aponim, and we said the lechem aponim is also a korban mincha, and if part of the lechem aponim is broken off, even one loaf from the 12, then all the loaves are apostle. But here we have a special case, because we're talking before kmitza. Now we said that with kmitza commences the requirement of kahuna, and therefore the avoda goes into full gear with kmitza. And now it's chasera, part of the mincha was missing. Let's say you need an isaron and there's less than isaron, but it was before kmitza. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, yavi mitov beiso v'yamalena. Whatever he's missing in the mincha, he'll go back home and he'll be mashlim. And there's no problem with that because it's before kmitza. Reish Lakish amar lo yavi mitov beiso v'yamalena. In other words, Reish Lakish thinks that the process of preparing the mincha begins when the Kohen takes the flour and the oil from his house and brings it into the mikdash. And therefore, at that point, we already require shlema. And if it's chasera, it's possible. So according to Reish Lakish, there's no option here to remedy the chasera by having the Kohen go back home and bringing that volume of flour that's necessary to be mashlim the shear. So Gemara now analyzes this machlokas. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Mevi Mitot Beis Amalena. Why is it that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if the Minchas Chaseri just goes back to his house and the Kohen brings an amount, a volume of flour in order to be mashlim the shear and replenish that which was lost, because kmitza kavale. When does the mincha become a mincha? This is like a conceptual question. When is the shem mincha chal? And according to Rabbi Yochanan, the shem mincha is only chal with kmitza, because that's the point in which the Kohen gets into full gear to do the avodah of the kmitza. So therefore, you can't invalidate a mincha before it's a mincha. All the psulim of a mincha only apply after the shem mincha emerges, and the shem mincha emerges only after kmitza. But Reish Lakish says, no, we need the kli. Do you remember that we discussed that even before kmitza, we need to place the ingredients of the mincha into a kli shares in order to sanctify it, and therefore Reish Lakish Amar Lo Yovi Mitoch Beis Avimalena. You've already established this mincha with its kedusha, but it's chasera. So therefore, when kedushas kli kavale, in other words, once you take the kli shares and you add into the kli shares the flour and the oil, then at that point, the shem mincha is chal. The emergence of the shem mincha is coincidental with the kiddush, the sanctification of the mincha. And since the kiddush of the mincha takes place before kmitza, therefore at that point we already need that the mincha be kshera, not psula. And now we find that the mincha is chasera, therefore it's psula. And now Rabbi Yochanan is going to bring a proof that becomes an objection to Reish Lakish. And he's going to quote a Mishnah with regard to Mitzorah. Now, Mitzorah needs a lug of shemen for the purpose of hazos. There are 7 hazos, and then there's also placing the shemen on 3 different parts of the Mitzorah's body as part of the process of his tahara. And we have a Mishnah which is in Negoim, and it says that chaser halug, if the lug is not there, in other words, he doesn't have the full volume of shemen, which is that of a lug, is then it all depends. At what point was the lug shemen chaser? Ad shelo yotzak, the Mishnah says that if the Kohen did not do the yitzika, which means he pours it from one hand into the palm of his other hand, and from that palm he's going to do all the hazos and the matan shemen on the body of the mitzorah, then yimalena. All we have to do is be mashlim and replenish that volume of the lug shemen that's missing. If let's say you have 90% of the lug, then just go and find shemen and add it to replenish the 10% that's missing. So now the Gemara is assuming that this is a kash on Reish Lakish. And the reason for the kash on Reish Lakish is because the Mishnah says that it all depends on Yitzika. And the parallel to Yitzika in this case would be Kmitza in Menachos. And therefore the Mishnah is implying that had there been a chisaron in the mincha before Kmitza, then it would be parallel to the case of a chisaron in the log shemen before the Yitzika. And the Mishnah says explicitly that if there's a chisaron in the log of shemen before Yitzika, then you just simply replenish it. There's no psul in the in the oil, even though the oil was already put into a kli shares. Whereas according to Reish Lakish, we have a problem here because once it's put into a kli shares, then the psul is going to invalidate the the sanctification in the kli shares, and if it's chaser, then ein malasot, as we say in Hebrew, just throw it out. Tiyufta, the Gemara says that this doesn't have an answer. There's no defense for Reish Lakish. In which case, Tosfos right away raises the objection: how can it be that Reish Lakish was unaware of a Mishnah? Sometimes you have a brisa, and the brisos were brought by various Amoraim who quoted the various brisos, but not everyone had the brisa. But that's not true in the case of a Mishnah. So it's not possible to say that there was no, that there was no knowledge on the part of Reish Lakish from a Mishnah, and Tosfos doesn't have any solution to that problem. Okay, so we have now two different controversies between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Let's just go over the two very simply. Bekitzer Nimratz. If the Belila took place outside the Azara, here Rabbi Yochanan is the Machmir, and he says that the Belila itself, because it requires a Klishares, therefore, if it was done outside the Azara, it's Psula, whereas Reish Lakish is Mekil. Then we have another Machlokes in the case of Chasera, if the Mincha was Chasera before Kmitza, and here Adarabba. Rabbi Yochanan is the Mekil, and Reish Lakish is the Machmir. Now the Gemara is going to add a third Machlokes, Itmar. Shirayim shechosru ben Kmitza le'aktorah. Now we know that the goal of Kmitza is to be Matir Shirayim. So all the remnants after the Kmitza are now eaten by the Kohen. They can't eat the Shirayim until the Kmitza is implemented. And in that sense, it parallels in Zvachim Zrikas Adam. For example, in a Korban Chatos, the Kohanim eat the basar of the Korban, but only after the dam was Nizrak al Gabi Mizbeach. And now the problem is Chasera. What happens if the Kmitza was already implemented, and now the Kometz has to be burnt on the Mizbeach such that the Shirayim will now be mutter to Kohanim? However, the problem now is that it's chaser. And if it's chaser, the mincha is not complete, then it's possible. But Rabbi Yochanan says, and again, here Rabbi Yochanan is make it once again, and he says, maktir kometz aleim. He can go ahead and burn the kometz, even though the mincha itself is chaser. And we'll see why. Reish Lakish Amar ein maktir kometz aleim. You want to say that now, for the sake of Heter Shirayim, we're going to burn the kometz. We can't do that because the mincha is chasera. In other words, Reish Lakish holds that kometz and kmitza does not stand on its own as an independent avoda. It's dependent upon its efficacy to be matir the shirayim. And if you cannot be matir the shirayim because it's chasera, then you don't do the kmitza, and you're not going to be maktir that kometz on the mizbeach. So according to Reish Lakish, it's a package deal. Haktoras, hakkometz, and the heter shirayim as a result of haktoras hakkometz is one and the same. And if there's no possibility of heter hashirayim, then there's no possibility of haktoras hakkometz. Now, what the Gemara is going to do now, it's going to introduce a Mishnah that records machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. And the Gemara is going to try to say that the entire controversy here between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish only exists within the context of one of those two Tanoim, namely Rabbi Yoshua. But there's no machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish according to Rabbi Eliezer. And that's what the Gemara points out over here. Rabbi Eliezer, Kuliyamalo Pligi, everybody agrees, whether it's Rabbi Yochanan or Reish Lakish, that you go ahead and you maktir the kometz. And the reason for that is, as we'll soon see, is because Rabbi Eliezer goes as far as to say that even if the Shirayim were completely lost, totally avud, you would still be maktir the komets. And therefore, the machlok between Rav Shlokish and Rabbi Yochanan about a case of chaser, where it's not lost, but it's just missing a part, is ki pligal liba de Rabbi Yoshua. Now we're going to see the machlokes recorded in the Mishnah later on at Daf Chav Vav, and the Mishnah says, Nitmu Shireh, Nisrufu Shireh, Avdu Shireh. If the Shirayim were burnt, or they were tameh, or they were lost, is Kemidas Rabbi Eliezer Kshera. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we will still go ahead and will burn the komets. And that's a case where the Shirayim are completely destroyed. They were burnt, they were lost, or they were tameh. But however, Kemidas Rabbi Yeshua, meaning according to the standards of Rabbi Yeshua, psula. Because again, Rabbi Yeshua holds, and now we're going to plug in Reish Lakish's logic, that the Ktoras HaKmitza, HaKometz, is totally dependent upon its ability to be Matir Shirayim. There are no Shirayim, because the Shirayim were completely lost. Man de Posal, Reish Lakish is Rabbi Yeshua. Again, according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's no debate. Rabbi Eliezer says even if the Shirayim are completely gone, they don't exist anymore, you can still be mocked to the komets. But within the framework of Rabbi Yeshua, at first glance, Reish Lakish is correct, because you need the Shirayim in order to justify the Haktoras HaKmitza, HaKometz, because Haktoras HaKometz depends upon the ability of Matir Shirayim, and now the Shirayim are chaser. However, Man de Machshir, we can explain Rabbi Yochanan even within the context of Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua will say that if the Shirayim are completely lost, then there's no Haktar Saimurim. Ad Kar Lo Amar Rabbi Yeshua Asam El Delo Ishtayr. Ishtayr means there's nothing left. There's no Shirayim. Avol, according to Rabbi Yochanan, Heichad Ishtayr Afilu Rabbi Yeshua Modele. Even though it's chaser, we should not equate chaser with avud, nisraf, or nitma, because in the latter cases, there's nothing left. But in the case of chaser, where there's still plenty of the mincha, we only need, according to Rabbi Yochanan's interpretation of Rabbi Yeshua, that there should be some efficacy to the aktoras ha-komets. That efficacy would be achieved even on a chaser, even if the shirayim are not complete. The Sanya, now we need to prove and establish Rabbi Yochanan's distinction between partial loss of the shirayim and total loss of the shirayim. The Sanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Yeshua Omer Kol Azvachim Shebatorah Shenishtair Mehen Kizayis Basar Kizayis Chela is Zorek Hadam. What it means is, as we said before, that the Zrikas Hadam has the efficacy of being matir the basar. So therefore, we need at least a kizayis of basar. Now, let's keep in mind that we'll take a korban chatos as a prime example. There's the achila of that part of the korban, the basar, which is eaten by the kohanim, and then there's the chelev and the avarim that have to be burnt on the mizbeach. The validity of the zrika to be matir doesn't require that it be matir everything. Both the basar la'achila and the chalavim la'aktara al gabi mizbeach. One or the other are sufficient, but you have to have one or the other. So you're going to need a kizayis basar or a kizayis chelev to do a maisa achila or a maisa ktara. Once you have that, then zorik hadam. Now the question is, since it's an either-or situation, meaning you still have a kizayis of either basar or chelev. What happens if you have a chatzi zayis of basar and a chatzi zayis of chelev? And here's where the Brisa continues and says, "B'chatzi zayis basar, b'chatzi zayis chelev eno zorikas hadam." And the reason for that is because there are two fundamentally different achilos here. There's achilos Kohen, and then there's the achila of the Mizbeach through the Haktor of the Yevarim and the Chalavim. We can't mix the two and integrate them to form a Kazayas. However, that distinction between Basar and Chalavim applies only to a Chatas or an Osham, but it does not apply to Korban Olah. Because Korban Olah, there's no matir. In other words, the Zrika of an Olah is just that's it. There is no achilas kohanim. It's kulo kolil. It's completely burnt on this bear. And therefore, ba'ola afilu b'chatzi zayis basar v'chatzi zayis chelev. There's absolutely no difference between basar and chelev. Everything goes on the mizbeach. Everything is burnt, and therefore they can be integrated. If you have a chatzi zayis of basar and a chatzi zayis of chelev, is zorikas adam v'neisha ba'ola kulo kolil. Oh, now the Brisa addresses the case of mincha. And in the case of mincha afal pisha kula kayemes, lo yizrok. Now, what's going on over here? What does it mean, lo yizrok? Zrikas hadam is only in zvachim. There's no such thing as zrikas hadam in menachos. You can have kamitza of the flour and oil, but not zrika. And that's exactly what the Gemara is about to raise here. But the point here is that we're going to try to explain this line, Afal Pisha Kula Kiemes Lo Yizrog, on the next Amud, on Amud Beis of Daf Tes. And that explanation is going to be a basis, or shall we say a proof, to Rabbi Yochanan's distinction between completely chaser, like Avud, Nisrav, as opposed to chaser, where it's partially lost. So that's what we're going to try to figure out now as we go to Amud Beis.